And we are live. Welcome to Hot Take Express with Kent Chamberlain. I am Kent Chamberlain, your host. This is episode 6. Sherman's middle name was Tecumseh. So this is a really big episode, and I've got a lot of things to do today. This is being recorded on Sunday morning, the 18th of September 2022. And I am trying to make good on my homework assignment of 3 episodes. So, anyway, I feel like people today would be more patriotic if they knew the history of America. Not a whitewashed history that excuses every crime, not a revisionist history that finds nothing but wickedness in America, but just the straight facts. I also feel like people today wouldn't be so vulnerable to land back ideological appeals if they knew the history of us natives they supposedly want to hand the country over to. This is going to be one of many, many videos that come that talks about history of both natives in this country and, just world history in general. To construct proper theory, you need to be able to do proper class analysis, and to do that, you need to understand proper history. Writing theory or doing class analysis without understanding history quickly leads you into error, because you don't understand why certain groups did certain things, which obscures their class nature, which makes you trust them maybe when you shouldn't trust them. And that just falls apart. So anyway, I'm going to start on a personal level. My ancestors come from many places, but mostly from Scotland, Ireland, upstate New York, the Ohio River Valley, and Illinois. Besides the Scots and Irish, I'm descended from the Haudenosaunee, no idea which of the nations, just that they were Haudenosaunee, the Shawnee, and the Potawatomi. And if you add up the native ancestry, it's somewhere between an eighth and a fourth. My mom is a genealogist, and, could probably give me the exact percentage, but it's somewhere between that. But all the same, I was raised white in a white-identifying family. I look white. But yeah, like my said, my mom's a genealogist, and she keeps tales of our ancestors from all of the places they were alive. And the reason why I exist in this particular combination is for this intermixing is that there was a time in English history when only my English and French ancestors were white. The Scots blood is from only the most legitimate of royal bastards, so there's a tiny drop of everything in Europe in me, just because of that's how royals work. They just kept marrying other royal houses from all over Europe over and over again. But back to the point, Scots and Irish marry the natives, and black people sometimes. There's some in my family, because of none of us were white in those days. We were all like the quote-unquote colored underclass. Indentured servants and occasionally literal slaves were taken from Celtic countries because the legal ruling against slavery initially only applied to England and the English, extending to Scotland and Ireland only after the Acts of Union of 1707 and 1801 respectively. Before then, white slavery in Celtic countries was fine. It was, something that happened to debtors often. Good way to empty the debtors' prisons is just have them go work on the tobacco plantations. I mean, you can read ships' manifests, and the names of the slaves are names of people that are considered white these days, just Scottish or Irish names. But so anyway, slaves and indentured servants of all different races, they regularly escaped the frontier, where they would settle among and intermarry with the natives. The Seminole Nation of Florida is a great example of this, because they fought the feds 3 times because they wouldn't hand back slaves that had escaped their territory. And Florida is just one big open swamp, so it was vicious, cutthroat 1800s guerrilla war, 3 different times. And they are some of the biggest BAMFs in America, and I feel like nobody talks about them. The Seminoles. Anyway, because and then like, oh yeah, and here's the cool thing about the Seminoles: the peace treaty, or the thing that ended the Third Seminole War was they were basically just driven to Cuba, and treated like the other natives and black people on the plantations in Cuba. So in a way, you could consider modern Cuba like a successor state to the Seminole Nation that waged guerrilla war on the U.S. So there's kind of like a track record there. Like there's a pattern to history. Like this Cuban nation has a history of defying the U.S. because they have part of their roots today were doing that. But yeah, like the violent, like something that is often leveled at the frontiersmen of the pioneers of like American history are that they're violent and they had Nazgul leanings. And you know what I say to that? Yeah, that's pretty much accurate. They did. But the thing is, those traits themselves were borrowed from the natives. Like I said in the last video, most native nations had some sort of tradition relating manhood to war, and the reintroduction of the horse to North America made this tradition much deadlier. Where you had, like previously buffalo hunts were these very difficult coordinated things where you had to kill a whole bunch at a time because that was the only way to do it, and you did it by like burning fires behind them and scaring them into running off a cliff, and then you'd have to like cook and preserve the meat and whatnot. And the funny thing about that, the brains were like considered a delicacy, and those were always eaten real lickety split. Whereas like the rest of it was usually like saved as jerky or pemmican of some kind for later. But like then with the horse, you could kill a buffalo at a time because you could just run up to them and like shoot, or later shoot, and knock one off, take it, clean it, bring it home. So the horse made the plains natives a whole lot deadlier, both in hunting and war and in wartime. And the buffalo is just like how that was hunted is just a good demonstration of the difference. But yeah, like so anyway, these these manhood traditions relating to war were a big deal, and there was like these massive enmities sprung up out of nowhere from distant nations that now had the means to go across vast distances and fight each other. So some traditions were beginning to evolve to make the warrior role more symbolic, like the Lakota counting coup, where they would just like ride up to an enemy's line and whack them with a stick instead of like trying to kill them, and then like notch something on a stick saying that like they got another coup against the enemy, and that was just as fine as killing somebody, because it's like I could have, but I didn't. Because here's another thing: when the Lakota went to war, at least this is what one of my native or Lakota associates tell me, they would paint their faces not to scare the enemy, but to hide their faces from Wakantanka. Because they were ashamed of what they were going to have to do. So like there were some countervailing traditions to the warrior cult, I guess, for lack of a better term, the warrior cults that were predominating in the 1800s. Amongst many different native nations. But thing is, this happened, it was too little too late, because by the time these traditions evolved, we'd already beaten each other to a bloody pulp, and paved the way for America to walk right through. So the advent of the horse and the gun to North America set off scores, actually, of westward expansions. We only remember America's because it was successful. But like, it was the most successful Nazgul pioneer nation on a continent full of them. Like, speaking of the Lakota, and why these were westward expansions is because as European technology and entered, from the eastern coast of the U.S. and Canada, it was first the tribes east that would be able to expand west, and then as those tribes obtained guns, they would be able to expand west. And so, like, every tribe east of its neighbors was more powerful than its western neighbors, so the natural tendency was to attack west. Kind of like the Huns pushing the Germans, west in Roman times. The horse, the introduction of the horse mostly happened from Mexico, so that was actually coming northward, but that was spread a lot more through native channels because horses can breed, whereas you have to make guns. And natives could rear horses and breed horses just fine, like pretty soon after having horses, whereas natives couldn't make guns right away after getting guns. Nowadays, like the Diné Nation, also better known as the Navajo, they have their own gun manufacturing facility. I think that's awesome. Like, I've always respected the Diné. Like, very, very cool nation. One of the most powerful politically and economically in the modern era. Anyway, so like there were all these different expansions and all these different westward expansions. It's just that America was the most successful. But yeah, like the Lakota were one of them. The Lakota claim that they come from Wind Cave in the Black Hills, just north of Hot Springs on 385. And that therefore the Black Hills are theirs. That yes, they traveled east to what's now like Wisconsin and Minnesota for a time, but then they returned home, and that land is theirs. There are competing claims about like the Cheyenne and the Kiowas and others also claim the Black Hills. We'll get to that point in a later part of the video, but yeah, like as they expanded westward from Minnesota, they threatened to drive Washakie. There was a chief Washakie of the Shoshone, of one of the bands of the Shoshone, I forget which, but he threatened to drive him. They threatened to drive Washakie's band into the Great Basin where I live, where they could quote unquote eat crickets. I just think that's a hilarious diss because, like without access to the modern technology and crops from around the world that I have, that crickets and snakes and rabbits and maybe birds would be like what I have to eat. And what I have to drink, too, because, like, there's not a whole lot of naturally occurring sources of water here outside of when it rains. That's a diss, and that's real. Just one of those, quotable disses for the ages. Because of my modern comforts of life, I do not have to eat a cricket. I still do not know what a cricket tastes like, and I'm fine dying without that knowledge. But yeah, so that was the Lakota expanding westward. Now the Comanche, they actually didn't expand westward. They expanded southward. They expanded all over. They were some more Banffs. They raided Mexico so hard that the treaty between America and Mexico, where Mexico surrendered the southwest to us, it explicitly made the Comanche our problem. It's like one of the little consolation prizes Mexico got was like, yes, okay, America will send the cavalry and deal with the Comanche raids, because you got to understand, like, northern Mexico was like a wasteland. The Comanche did not f around. They were like, they'd come in, they'd take everything not nailed down, burn everything else, and head back out with all your stuff. And like, it got to the point where like the Mexican people would just like not live there, because they knew nothing they did there would, nothing they made there would get to stay theirs. Like, and the Mexican state was too weak to really stop them. Like, what the Mexicans called the Comancheria could have been its own independent state were it not, like, right next to Texas, including parts of modern-day Texas, probably, were it not for the United States coming through. And as far as it goes, like, the Comanche were allied with the Texans during Texas's War of Independence, if I recall correctly. Like, Sam Houston concluded treaties with several native allies to help him in his war. But yeah, like, then, like, and this, we've got, like, written records of this. I forget the dude's name, but there was, like, a native explorer in, like, that lived, his nation was in French Louisiana, like, right by New Orleans, not too far. I think they were the Caddo or something like that. But, he lived, it was the 1700s, and he had, like, he had traveled the North American continent from, like, sea to shining sea, literally, and wrote, there's two accounts of his travels that survive. One of them seems like it was redacted to not disprove the French theory about the Northwest Passage that was popular at the time, but, one of them, which was probably the real one, more accurately describes what he saw. And this guy saw... Oh, and I gotta say, there's a wonderful channel called Ancient Americas. Dude's an archaeologist, I think, like a professor in the field, I think. And he talks about all these different finds and, like, events and people from ancient America. And, like, throughout the hemisphere, and he did a great video on this topic recently. But yeah, everyone go check that out. Good stuff. But this video, or I mean this native traveler, this Caddo guy, he went to the Pacific Northwest, and he basically reported that, like, most of the places he'd gone, like, everyone was, like, upbeat and happy, and were happy to see him, and he was welcomed as a guest, like, as he traveled through. Like, they'd put him up for the winter, no problem, and they wanted to hear stories of where he'd been. Like, the Pacific Northwest were hospitable because, like, it was their duty, and they didn't want a bad reputation. But, like, everyone, a lot of people he ran across just seemed, like, bummed as hell, because slavery was rampant in the Pacific Northwest. And here's another thing. Here's why Native history matters, even if you don't care one bit about natives. Our history reveals the geographic patterns that America is too young to have seen revealed in full in its own history by itself yet. But you look at Native history, and a lot of what's happening in California and Nevada and, like, the rest of the country, it makes sense. You see parallels for it in our history. Not perfect, but, like, there's obvious patterns, and a lot of it's just driven by geography. That's the common denominator. Wildly different societies between then and now, but, like, the same geography. And so even though, we don't do things like the native way in a lot of cases, we still have the same geographic pressures that we're responding to. Um, like the ancient Puebloans and the drought that killed their society off, or I shouldn't even say that. That drove their society into deep decline for hundreds of years. Because Puebloans, their descendants still exist today. It's like saying that like Italians don't exist because the Roman Empire fell. But like they overtaxed the water resources of the Southwest, and we're kind of doing the same thing now. That recent bill that passed, one of the good things in it, and cinema put this in, of all people, was funding to help, like $4 billion to deal with the Colorado River drought, which is a good idea. If they make all the other cities along the Colorado Basin as efficient as Las Vegas, that would do a lot to take care of the drought. And I think that $4 billion is mostly just funding for that, and maybe buying off some, farmer rancher water rights. Just so that because that's where a lot of the water goes. I mean, and people bitch, and it's fair to a certain degree, because they could be doing more to make the water use efficient, like growing in greenhouses. But what a lot of people don't understand is America does not have a whole lot of year-round crop or places to grow crops. And California's inland valleys are one of them. And so they can turn water from the Colorado into crops we all eat, but just don't grow in most of the country in wintertime. But you can still have your fresh tomatoes and lettuce and onions and whatever, because they come from California. So at least as far as that goes, you can't, there is a case for farming there, even though it's so dry, even though the Colorado River is so precious, or water is so precious. There is a case for farming there. I just think it needs to be done more efficiently, and just everything all around there should just be done more efficiently. And I'm getting off topic because and I really need to not do that, because there's a very long video going to be anyway. So anyway, the coastal nations of the Pacific Northwest, they what this all to say is, they kept slaves taken in war, and it was a real mark on their society, like it was on ours. After being informed of the 13th Amendment by American traders, they built totem poles with Abe Lincoln's face on the top. This was misinterpreted by the traders as a mark of great respect. In fact, what the coastal nations were trying to do was like the local equivalent of putting a thief on blast because he stole their slaves. It's they were not a fan of the 13th Amendment. And one more thing about the ancient Puebloans, better known to laymen as the Anasazi. I'm going to write an article about them sometime. I've been promising this for years, actually, but it's going to be such a big undertaking, and I'm going to be goring and grilling up some sacred cows. So this is something I need footnoted. I can't just do my normal level of footnoting. I really need this has got to be academic. And so I'm kind of dreading writing this article, but it's going to be at least as well researched and thorough and if true, dynamic changing as the Yasudra And was. And for those who haven't read it, Zeusudra and the Conquering Refugee Nation is one of the works I'm proudest of. It doesn't really talk about like political theory so much. It's a straight historical piece, but it provides context for a lot of the things in the world that don't really have a context yet. And it's a series of like best guesses from an expert in the field, but it's dealing with prehistory, so best guesses in a lot of cases are all we have available to us. But yeah, anyway, when I write this article about the ancient Puebloans, it's like everything delicious from the Southwest. It's going to be spicy as hell because it's going to be goring with all these sacred cows. But anyway, for now, I'll just say that the pre-1492 history of the region has been deliberately obscured by native liberals and fascists because, yes, we are humans, we have our own liberals, we have our own fascists, and they are all throughout our history, just like they are all throughout European history and Asian history, because liberals and usually rule, and they usually depend on fascists to prop them up. So, yeah, the moral of the story is that none of my people are noble savages, quote-unquote. We're just as fucked up as anyone else on Earth. If you had put guns, germs, and steel in native hands, to quote, paraphrase Jared Diamond, instead of European ones, today Madrid might very well be called New Tenochtitlan. We didn't magically live in balance with the Earth either. That's hippie bullshit. Our ancestors arrived on these continents and pretty quickly wiped out all the megafauna there, but bison, jaguars, puma, and llamas. Okay, so you go through the historical record, or the paleontological record, sorry, Haas, of North America, and you see, woolly mammoths and saber-toothed tigers, and those things everyone knows and expects, but also this just weird stuff, huge ground sloths the size of school buses. I can't even imagine what that would look like. There were other things that kind of like hippos with hair, but not really. Stuff I can't even think of to describe. There was all kinds of stuff on this continent, and then they were just wiped out. But you look at every other place that when humans first get there, that's kind of what happens. The dodo. The first humans on Mauritius were like, hey, this bird is dumb and won't run away when we hunt it. So sweet, free meat, guys. And that was a cool 50 years, and now dodos don't exist. Every new Pacific island that the Polynesians and the Melanesians and the Micronesians reached, a lot of the animals there were wiped out. Soon, a couple hundred years after landing. It's not to say that, they're horrible people. I mean, yes, those were bad things that shouldn't have happened, but no one was consciously killing the last one of these things, right? It was just there was this game, it'd been present all their lives, it was getting a little rarer, and then they didn't see them around anymore. That's weird. It's only recently where we've begun to be able to be conscious of the passing of species. But we've been killing them off for, thousands of years. That's not an invention of the white man. But yeah, so the thing is, when we first arrived, we wiped out everything, but or all the big megafauna, which was most fragile to human changes. But everything that survived, we eventually, the descendants of the first people that came, gradually worked out a balance. And they still look to increase living standards. And, I feel that's what happens over time. Is, and this will happen with white Americans, too. White Americans will work out a balance with the nature of this continent. Our society will come to develop social mores and standards and cultural practices that are in tune with the ecology of the earth. And I'm not saying this is like some like great reset, depopulate the world, degrowth crap. Like, I really do believe that a certain type of environmentalism, like Republican environmentalism, is legitimate good, where you're not trying to like, yeah, okay, like there's some places like the Grand Canyon that should actually absolutely just be off limits to development and stuff. But then there's like other places where it's like you want to conserve the resources. You don't want to like uh mark them completely off limits, but like, it's still kind of a protected area for animals and stuff. I mean, like, and so like, and then there's there's higher forms of agricultural technology, I think, than even the stuff we have. The natives on before 1492 on this in this hemisphere had worked out various kinds of food forests. That's why, like, when the woods, when the European frontiersmen came through, were dripping with passenger pigeons. That's why all kinds of game was abundant, and like all kinds of foraging foods and stuff, like, and berries and whatnot, nuts. It's because these orchards were deliberately planted by native people to increase the productive capacity of the land, and to do so in a way that would stick more of these crops closer together in symbiotic ways that would like help them all be more productive. And the white men came through with their typical like European knowledge of how these things worked, and it's not their fault, but they were like, hey, this cool, the hunting here is really good, but we're just going to chop this forest down, get it out of the way, this useless forest, and so we can grow corn in rows. And that was, on reflection, probably stupid, at least to the extent it was done. Like, maybe if they'd cleared little patches like the natives did, and grew their crops there, that would have been fine. And then like this massive continent-wide hunting system would have been available, and we would have been one of the greatest exporters of like all kinds of meat and wild food products to this day. But we went down this path, and we're here, and we can't just like reverse ourselves immediately. The collective is trying to bring back a sort of sustainable approach to the environment, something that works with the nature instead of against it. But like doing this in a socialist manner that will actually benefit the working class, and not in a liberal manner that is a class weapon against the working class. I feel like ecology, a lot of the ecological, environmental, whatever movement is just a class weapon against the working class, and so the workers rightly resent it. But there is a deeper, more socialist ecological theory available to us that is properly followed. But so as they worked out a balance with the nature, they were still trying to improve their living standards. So like new innovations from abroad were welcomed. A founding father of the Haudenosaunee is literally named Corn Planter, because he pushed this exciting new crop from Mexico on his people, and it worked. Maize came to the New York area around 980. Maize was domesticated and cultivated first in Mexico from a wild plant called teosinte, and it took a long time to domesticate. A long time. I think it could be up to like 8,000 years, which is more than it took most other crops. Because if you look at like a modern era corn and you look at like teosinte, and it's wildly different. But and then part of why guns, germs, and steel didn't work in the favor of the Americas, but in the favor of Eurasia, was because Eurasia's got this east-west axis orientation where you can kind of grow the same basic crops in England that you can in Japan and everywhere in between. So you have you get a good crop package together and it can spread far and wide. Whereas in the Americas, you get a good crop package together and it's a north-south axis, so it spreads a lot more slowly because it has to adapt to a different day-night cycle and climate and temperature and whatnot as it goes. Like the crop constantly has to be re-evolved to the area it's spreading to. So it can still spread, but a lot more slowly because they were growing maize 3,000, it's something akin to the modern version. Some about 3,000 years, 3,000 BC, I want to say, in Mesoamerica, modern Mexico and Central America. Yeah, I think some. If it's not that, it's close, 2,000 BC. I didn't specialize in the Americas when I studied history, so I've just I can't say for sure, but it's something like that. And so, it took 3,000, 4,000 years for maize to get from Mexico to New York. But yeah, so the white supremacist idea that natives are somehow inferior and that's why we were conquered, that's also crap. It's not our fault that the continents are shaped the way they are. But yeah, so our quote-unquote balance with the earth, as the hippies say, it's just a technology tree going down a heavily agricultural path over many centuries. And this isn't uncommon amongst human societies because something very similar happened amongst the Aborigines of Australia and New Guinea, where they basically their tech trees specced into food forests, and that's how they advanced their society. It was just figuring out newer and better ways to grow food. Why? I think it's because those are obvious innovations that anyone in a society can make, anyone in a rural agricultural society can make. You don't have to be have special training to get an idea about the irrigation ditches and the rows of crops that you work with day in and day out for your whole life, and that just compounds over time. Whereas to get specced into and I think this is why Europe came out on top. I kind of agree with Diamond's theory on this. It's just the geography meant that you weren't going to have a big empire like in China, a big united stretch of territory. But you're going to have all these little kingdoms and nations and whatnot, because mountains and rivers and peninsulas make everything so defensible. And so because you've got all these separate kingdoms, they're all going to be fighting with each other, and therefore they're all going to be looking for an edge, and that's what allows technology to advance, because the cost of not embracing new ways is bigger than the cost of embracing new ways, because there is a cost to embrace new stuff. It puts people that were employed by the old ways out of business, and that could be a lot of people depending on the society. In places that didn't have those pressures, like Australia, New Guinea, and the Americas, I think that's why food forestry is what those societies spec'd into. Because you don't want to think of us as savages or idiots either. We're not noble savages, but we're not idiots or rubes. Anyone with the hand we were dealt would have played it roughly about the same, I think. If the most obvious way to advance your society is to look for better crops and spread them far and wide, and to figure out better ways to farm them, I mean, that's just going to be what you do. But yeah, like, so that was the pinnacle of our technology, that food forest that was there. But we were still very rudimentary metal workers until the Europeans showed up. Now, not so rudimentary that the Spanish could not cart off galleon loads of Inca treasure, of Inca gold and silver. Same with Aztecs, um, who called themselves the Mexica. Uh, and like you had gold and silver working up in the American Southwest as well to some degree, not as much. Copper working too. You had copper working actually throughout America, the modern United States. There's mines in Michigan, I want to say, or Minnesota, one of the Great Lakes states. But yeah, then there were mines in ancient times. Like the copper and bronze smelting was not very sophisticated, but like, yeah, like most of the United States was in the midst of the Bronze Age when the Europeans showed up, basically. And yeah, and like, and in the Bronze Age more widely, like in the Bronze Age Mediterranean, like people still had stone tools just because it was cheaper. Like, yes, the bronze tool was better, but it was so expensive. So it's like, depending on the job you were doing, like if it wasn't life or death, yeah, just use the bone knife or the stone knife or whatever. Like, and some stone, like obsidian, and this is more true in the Americas than in Eurasia, obsidian was valued as a material for blades, and like it actually can get sharper than metal and is used for some kinds of surgery to this day. Surgeons will use obsidian scalpels, but like a lot of the Aztec weaponry was made out of obsidian, and there were several Mesoamerican city-states who, because of their control of the obsidian trade, were able to become rich and powerful with that as like the only thing going for them to start with. But so yeah, like we were much better than the Europeans at like farming, but much worse at like high technology and like the basis of modern industrialization. But yeah, in 1491, our societies did not have the borders that they currently do, or even necessarily exist. Like a lot of what the early American settlers were dealing with, as far as natives go, were essentially post-apocalyptic societies, the remnants of, like the Cahokia culture that was devastated by European plagues. There was like one dude that got to like travel, one European dude that got to travel through the place and take frustratingly scarce notes about it to historians, before that culture just passed from history. I mean, like, the quote-unquote 5 civilized tribes, and that's what the whites called them, they are the descendants of the Cahokia culture, and they, have their own traditions about that haven't necessarily been fully embraced or understood by scholarship. For instance, I still don't entirely know. I've never had an occasion or the spare time to read it yet. But like, yeah, like that's an entire part of American history that's it's just a blank slate to most people. We know that it existed. The mounds of Cahokia are there outside St. Louis, and impressive if you're comparing it to say like Tenochtitlan. It's on that scale. But and it's interestingly enough, it has like a lot of the same features. Those ball courts that the Aztecs and the Incas had, and the Mayas too, well, they were at Cahokia. Like people were playing politically important ball games in fairly similar to basketball, in fact, in the United States long before basketball ever existed. But yeah, so now think about what would happen. Everyone's got like their plans for what would happen in a zombie apocalypse or whatever, but like, what would happen? A lot of us would just become nomads, essentially. Going from place to place looking for resources, survivors, some, better circumstances until we found something. And maybe we'd find something, but we'd be driven out by other more powerful bands, and that's kind of what happened to post-apocalyptic North America. And so the nomadic bands that replaced Cahokia were essentially post-apocalyptic refugees coming together with people who spoke similar tongues for protection, and not thousand-year-old nations virtually unchanged since Beringia. Now, that's not necessarily the case for like some of the nations further away from Cahokia, like the Lakota or some of the further north plains nations. Some of those might have been relatively unimpacted by the the Columbian exchange, at least at first. Maybe even beneficially impacted because they got the horse right as Cahokia was falling. And by the way, we don't know if that was a united empire or just like a collection of city-states. It was more than one, and Cahokia is what we call it. We don't know what they called themselves. But yeah, like, the nomadic bands of the northern Great Plains wouldn't have been cavalry raiders in 1491. They had no horses. They probably would have still hunted, like I said, by using fires to scare bison off a cliff. There's a site in the panhandle of Nebraska called the Hudson Ring Bison Kill Site, where Paleo Indians, as they're called in the literature, hunted and killed bison 9,000 years ago. That was a fun couple weeks of interning. I lost a tent, met a lot of cool people. But yeah, anyway. So these nomadic plains natives in 1491 would have traded goods like buffalo robes and animal furs to the Cahokia culture for things like abalone shells from the coast. And why? Why would proto Lakota, or we don't know if they were Lakota, or whoever, why would they want abalone shells? Well, to this day, there are ceremonies called sage burning and smudging. Like the sage is so it's like thought to drive out evil spirits and unclean spirits. And various nations do it, not just the Lakota, but like where you'll but it's got to be burned on an abalone shell, and the sage does, and then like you waft the spirits up and you like inhale them to like purify your body ritualistically, and the smell of the sage burning fills the place you're trying to purify. And then when you smudge, you just take like some of the sage ashes and you mark the people with it to like as further cleansing, I guess. When I worked as a librarian at an elementary school on the Lakota res, it was a Catholic elementary school, and but funnily enough, we smudged every morning, or at least we'd burn sage. And in wintertime, when I cook inside, my fireplace here, I'm burning sagebrush, so I'm ritualistically purifying myself every time I cook dinner. But yeah, but the thing is, abalone shell is what the sage is burned on for those ceremonies. So that's probably, if that's not the exact significance of the trade in those days, it would have been something like it. Because if it wasn't that very tradition, it would have evolved out of a similar tradition. But yeah, this so after Cahokia fell, the French and Spanish traders out of New Orleans, because remember, French Louisiana was occasionally Spanish Louisiana, and then French Louisiana, and then Spanish Louisiana. Like it changed hands. But yeah, it was Spanish, and then Napoleon conquered Spain, put his brother on the throne, and took their colonies, and then he sold them to America. But it was back and forth. So but in any case, the traders out of New Orleans would have replaced Cahokia's role to the northern plains nations. So other than the horses and the guns causing Lakota westernward expansion, the northern Great Plains were probably the least impacted by 1492 at first. Like I said earlier, America was the most successful Nazgul pioneer nation on a continent full of them. It was either forever war in North America, or one of these Nazgul societies was going to have to win. America won because it had better crops. The Eurasian crop package was superior to that available in North America at the time, especially the livestock package. They had the dog, and we had the horse and the ox and the donkey, the mule, chickens, goats, pigs. I mean, all these. So yeah, we had America won because it had better crops, better technology, and far more people, and like a continent full of people looking, over in Europe that were looking to move here. America, quote unquote, as an ethnicity, is essentially just Europe's surplus and outsourced post-feudal working class, far more based than the bourgeois bloats that starved them out of the home countries. A lot of the global hatred, the European, I think this is a fair class analysis to make. A lot of the hatred of European countries for American culture and society is essentially class hatred. We are the workers and the lumpens and the lower middle class people that were starved out of Europe on purpose. The survivors of the potato famines and the revolutions that failed and whatnot. And we came out here and we made good, and they're threatened by that. The bourgeois and labor aristocrat survivors that were able to stay in Europe, that were able to afford to stay in Europe, they're offended that we didn't just shrivel up and die. And so, the more we succeed, the more of a threat we are. The more of a threat we are to the ruling classes of Europe. And so I think, a lot of anti-Americanism is essentially classist against working class white people, which is the basis of America. And so, this working class republic, once it had it, when it wasn't really led by the working class either, it was a republic full of working class people, founded, but its leadership was the local, bourgeoisie. But America represented, even though it represented very terrible things for the native societies that it kind of, physically replaced, it represented very good things, a new chance for the entire working classes of Europe. A chance to not only have some land, but have a vote, a say in the local government, to not be harassed by the local gendarmerie. It was an amazing idea in theory, and in practice it wasn't usually amazing, but it was a lot better than what they faced in Europe. But so it was the coming of America was kind of two-sided, because like it was a Nazgul society. Like, it, thing is, you get a Nazgul society that's good at it, and just all it does in the long run is inspires its competition to get good. The Mongols ran rampant over Europe, over all of Eurasia for hundreds of years, and then their neighbors got good. They started getting better at firearms and cannons and stuff, and horse archers just weren't as cool or as effective as they had been suddenly. So like, America growing up in this continent full of Nazgul nations, like, it was the more effective one. But Nazgulry itself is bad, but like, one of these Nazgul societies had to win. It was just, America was just the most powerful of the bunch, so it won. But like, now that one of them won, we have a continental union. But like, and that's a cool thing, and I'll get to that. But like, that the union is the good thing that came out of that thing. That is like, it really was traumatic for natives. For us, like, it wasn't just a military conquest, right? And it wasn't like just a genocide or an ethnic cleansing either. Like, and I'm not even sure it's right to think of it in that terms, because what the American conquest did to us is it brought modernity. And like Haas has noted, the transition to industrial modernity has been traumatic for every society that underwent it. Most native nations had taken the horse and become nomadic raiders just for industrialization to fatally undermine it. Like, they shot the buffalo out from under the Lakota and the other plains tribes. They made conveyor belts for industrial machinery out of the buffalo hides. They figured out a way to do that. So industrialization fatally undermined their old way of life. And like, this isn't unique, because like, you get nomadic raiders, and then the settled societies around them are always going to have suspicions, because the nomadic lifestyle is just far more effective militarily until the modern era. Until the modern era, like, nomads can just utterly body settled people, and this happens over and over again. And usually the nomads body the settled people and like rule over them, but slowly become soft and weak and adopt the ways of the settled people, and then like the people who stay the nomads then conquer that guy and wipe out his dynasty, and the cycle starts all over again. Like, that was a lot of worldwide or Eurasian history, like, and North American too, like I said, with the Comanche. And then, so once the settled people got the upper hand, they kind of tried to keep it, and weren't always subtle about it. Like, even the enlightened Soviet Union, they turned thousands of square miles of a different country, Mongolia, that was their ally, specifically they chose for their military base, their top secret military base that no one was allowed into without authorization. They chose the thousands of square miles of Mongolia where Genghis Khan's undiscovered grave might lie, specifically so that no one could go and find it. Because 800 years later, they were still pissed about the quote-unquote Tatar yoke is what they call it. And yeah, like, so they will first be, settled civilizations in general will first be brutal and show nomads the whip hand. And only after they get the military situation under control will they try to become humanitarians. And that's subject to all the liberal bullshit that usually infects charity ventures and humanitarianism in general. Because, this pattern is how modernity presented itself to natives. Like, we were nomadic raiders and warriors that had to be brought under control for the good of the Union. And only after that was dealt with could the Union talk about like treaty goods and commod benefits and whatnot. But yeah. So given this reality, America's dealings with the natives, while harsh and even genocidal, are better interpreted as an aspect of the harsh native transition to modernity than America being some kind of uniquely evil nation. Like the Mongols, America was more powerful, not more wicked than its vanquished foes. So, what did this Continental Union cost us natives? To destroy the self-reliance of the Great Plains nations, the bison herds were wiped out, almost to extinction. Multiple nations relied on the bison for literally everything at the time and became federal dependents on reservations. Literally just, dependent on handouts for whether they lived or died. Whole native nations were wiped out for sport by the most brutal of American settlers, the Californians. These jerks mined gold while the Civil War raged, so we shouldn't be surprised at their evil or that it's continued today. Literally, whole native nations like the Yupik, the Pima, what were the ones when I lived in Vandenberg Air Force Base as a kid? The Chumash, just wiped out, gone. Like, there's maybe a dozen people that have like figured out that they're genealogically descended from, in part, from these nations that live in the modern era, if that. Like, they just don't exist. Why? They were in the way. There was gold to be mined, and basically they were used as literal slaves, and the Californian government passed laws making this okay, and it wasn't technically called slavery. It was called something else, but basically to enslave the California natives, and if not kill them outright, because they also offered bounties for their scalps, make them work the shittiest, most deadly jobs. After the initial mining boom was over, they started getting scientific with the gold extraction, right? And one of the things you can do to get gold out of the rivers in California is put mercury in the rivers. The gold will attract the mercury, and you can pull the mercury or the gold out of the mercury pretty easily through some chemical tricks. And voila. But the thing is, first they had to make the mercury, which means mining it, which was done by the natives, and then refining the mercury, which done by the natives. And at these refining areas for the mercury, nothing within 8 miles was even alive. No bird, no insect, no tree, no blade of grass, okay? And these natives were made to work every day, for the rest of their lives in these places where nothing could live. And of course the toxic fumes got them after a decade at the most, This was the end that the native peoples of California, some of them with spectacular stories, like the Chumash, I'm pretty sure are descendants, at least in part, of Polynesian wayfarers that made it all the way to California. But all of that rich cultural history gone because some liberals needed to make money. And their children are the rulers of Silicon Valley today, and equally ruthless and unconcerned about anyone's welfare. They refer to the rest of us as flyover country, and that flyover country is where white people, native people, Mexicans, Hispanics, anybody lives. It's not a race thing. They just hate all of us. And if the moment we're in the way, we're gone. They send the fashion. So anyway, back to what this Continental Union cost us. The Treaty of Fort Laramie, signed in the 1850s, I want to believe, was the first of many attempts to not only create peace between us and the Americans, but peace between ourselves. We were paid to show up and sign. The first beneficiary is the federal welfare state, because we were the first people to regularly threaten the federal state. And I mean it. We got blankets and coffee and nice things that like the whites had, tobacco and all this stuff. That hell, I got coffee right now. I mean, like, what would life be without coffee? These were probably some of the first natives to drink coffee on the regular. And they were the first Americans, and I think the case of Bright Eyes, who the indie musicians named after, passed around that same time, declaring that Native Americans had the rights of American citizens. Like, Bright Eyes, I think, wanted to vote or something like that, and the case established that he could, or it was something along those lines. But yeah, the treaty goods, just like the modern welfare state, it was provided not out of any shitlib notions that we deserved it somehow. It's like, because they would just kill us outright when they could, as per California. But no, the treaty goods were provided because we had guns and horses and trained with them continually all our lives, and we were the most natural warriors since Genghis Khan, and our loyalty was more cheaply bought than fought. Again, they still wanted to, like, kneecap us as much as possible. The bison went next to extinct for 100 years and is only coming back now because that made us dependent. It was like, if you're a elected politician in Mexico, like, there's a phrase, like, forget the exact Spanish, but it's essentially, take the silver or the bullet. Like, because the gangs, the cartels will come to you and they'll, like, either offer you money to, like, turn a blind eye to their doings, they're shipping narcotics up north, or they'll shoot you because you're getting in the way. You have to take either the silver or the bullet. Like, there's no other choice. So, I mean, some of them do choose the bullet, and then, like, they just, make sure they're, very well protected and then go after them. But that's not the most common decision, as you might imagine. So, like, you can think of this treaty federal welfare state and our modern welfare state. And this is something where I very wholeheartedly agree with the Republican Party as it currently exists, but for different reasons. They exist basically just to prevent opposition to it, like opposition to themselves. I mean, like, remember, Nixon, conservative Republican, Richard Milhouse Nixon, passed WIC, right? And it was because the Black Panthers were basically providing the equivalent of WIC. And Nixon was a Cold Warrior and knew that it was dangerous to let communists feed your proletarians. So even though, like, conservatives hate the welfare state and they hate, a lot of them had stereotypical notions about inner city black people at the time, they passed a program that primarily benefited those inner city black people because it was an issue of fighting communism, or it was an issue of national security. And so the welfare state is connected to national security and essentially benefits imperialism in the long run. But yeah, so, like, and the welfare state under FDR, like, more broadly, it was extended to the American working class when it became a threat due to the spread of international communism and the need to turn them into a labor aristocracy for national security purposes. Also, because this happened, this is why boomers are often insufferable. Even if they were working class in their lifetimes, they were labor aristocrats, paid better, much better than their labor itself would have been valued at, and therefore better understood in class analysis terms as a middle class. So yeah, like, the beginnings of the federal welfare state. We were paid in commodity goods to stay on the reservations and not bother anyone. This was done to pacify and not liberate us, which is always the point of the welfare state in national politics. Many of the later Indian wars, like after Little Bighorn, when the issue was mostly settled, were a result of the bankrupt federal governments stiffing and starving the reservations to kind of like balance the budget on the back of the natives. And then, you've got this welfare state that's supposed to be paying them off, but then they don't get paid. And then they're like, well, all right, we're going to fight you then. Like, you took away all of our other ways to to feed ourselves and made us dependent on you. So we're dependent on you. You're not delivering. Time to start burning some wagon trains down, I guess. It wasn't the wars, especially the later wars were legitimately done in self-defense and just for the basic well-being of their people. Anyone in their shoes would have done similarly to Chief Joseph or Sitting Bull or Crazy Horse. So yeah, these commodity goods that we were bought off with, and after the later Indian Wars, the federal government did learn its lesson and made sure that the treaty goods arrived on time every time in full, and we haven't really had any repeats since. There have been the growth of the American Indian movement has since the 60s has caused more political unrest, perhaps, but not we're not talking. There's no one's gonna run in. It's not the situation of a war or anything, and it hasn't been since Wounded Knee, and that was more of a massacre than a battle anyway. But yeah, anyway, so these commodity goods that we were paid off with, they still exist per treaty, and every enrolled tribal member gets an allotment per month to this day, and it's usually just food. Everything is canned, and typical items are beans, vegetables, cheese, beef, flour, coffee, bacon, and oil or lard. I'm just explaining this because there is actually a lot of misunderstanding as to what exactly goes into this stuff, what people get. When Trump came out with his proposal to replace food stamps with just a box of canned goods and groceries that people would get every month instead, and that was widely panned. Well, that's what natives get, right? Trump's idea that most people hated, that is actually a reality for natives. Now, in the modern day, a lot of native families can get that and also qualify for food stamps from the state they're in. Not always. But so they can still buy more fresh goods and stuff. But you're not going to, these commod goods are not going to be anything fresh or particularly healthy. They'll keep you alive. They're better than not eating, but we're not, these, yeah, I'm trying, and in some cases they're as good as commod beans are just as good as the beans you'd get, canned beans you get from the store. Most of the stuff is as good as canned goods can get, but it's still just canned, right? However, just the supplying these contracts actually helped drive the greater history of the West. Because, the federal contracts to supply commod beef to the reservations helped spark the first cattle drives from Texas along the Goodnight Loving Trail, you may have heard of if you're a fan of Western history. As far as commod cheese, well, it tastes like the government made it. That is a accurate way of describing the taste of commod cheese. But I will say this: it grows on you, and I've especially my native friends that grew up on the reservations and were enrolled. I'm not enrolled. They've got oftentimes warm memories and fond memories of the commod cheese. I can see that. You grow up in hard times and hard circumstances, and the things that were your companions in those days are always going to be have a warm place in your heart. I can totally get that. And on Indian tacos, which legit you gotta try if you ever pass through the Lakota Res or any of the other reses where this is a thing. yeah, like, the Kamado cheese tastes just fine on Indian tacos. Um, but yeah, like, most of modern native culinary art dates from this period, the period of, like, the treaty goods, because earlier recipes were mostly lost as first, and like they obviously we ate food before this. Um, like we had recipes for like how to make pemmican and pozole and all these other things that like are starting to come back or never fully left, and because like I think the American Southwest held on to it more of its culinary traditions than the rest of native North America did. But like, yeah, these commodity goods came to dominate our diets, so most of our culinary arts are just dealing with the question of how to turn these things into, you know, delicious meals. But bourgeois hipster fashion, of all things, has done something useful and tracked down and resurrected these pre-Laramie native recipes from modern times. And so there's a culinary legacy that was once thought lost that's actually coming back. I know I forget the name of the restaurant, but there's one in Denver that I would like to go to one day. It's like yeah, serving Native American recipes from before Laramie. But yeah, both I gotta say, those pre Laramie recipes are probably only going to be accessible to the rich for now, and even though they're kind of like the result of cultural genocide is probably too strong a term, but like even though they're the result of like foreign or outside influences and political weakness, modern day native workers disproportionately use the post Laramie cooking styles. So, but they're both legitimate and they're both worth perpetuating. I mean, like, just because they were using ingredients that might not strike the rest of us as like something we want to eat all day every day, they were able to turn that into something amazing. Like, I mean, think about like this quote unquote slave food that black people came up with, and it's like actually awesome, and like we call it soul food today, and it's amazing, this amazing stuff, and it was just like invented by slaves trying to get by as best they could, and so like a lot of beauty can come from that, and so just because it was born out of pain doesn't mean that we should throw it away or forget about it. Both forms of native culinary arts are legitimate and worth perpetuating. But yeah, so our traditions and ways were almost wiped out by concerted federal effort. Kill the Indian, save the man was a well-intentioned bullshit policy that sprang out of the dim-sock middle-class academia of its time. There was a need to create a sense of American nationhood among all its citizens, but this policy went way too goddamn far. Similarly traumatic but quicker forced Americanization hit German Americans in World War I, especially with the first Red Scare, because they were worried that the German Americans were primarily communists, which was factually true. They were based, and the base of the Republican Party at the day, and that's when the Republican Party started to really lose its way, was after that Red Scare. But yeah, forced Americanization also happened to Japanese Americans in World War II. And another thing that this union cost us is that to this day, in frontier towns, we're discriminated against. I haven't ever felt it because I look white, and I am mostly white. But, like, I've got native friends that have been pulled over in these frontier towns for driving while native. Like, don't look native and be driving in Sheridan County, Nebraska. The cops there are fuckers. Yeah, the tiny town where I went to college, it had a federal consent decree governing its police interactions for natives the whole time I was there. And I personally saw a real shitlib of a judge, last name Garman, refuse bail because the Lakota family he was breaking up over some drug crime was $200 short of the $1,000 bail that he was asking. So this is the racist justice system that endures there to this day. I don't want to pretend America's like all glorious and wonderful and there's no downsides. Absolutely not. That's not true. It's just better than what would replace it. And that's what we're getting to. Because what have we gotten from this Continental Union? First off, we're directly responsible for its major institutions. Ben Franklin knew that his pals were in over their heads, so he asked the Haudenosaunee for their help in creating a federal government like the one we already had. The one we Haudenosaunee already had. Because remember, we were like 5 tribes, and then later 6 when the Tuscarora joined together in a federal government. There is no single Haudenosaunee tribe. It's like Haudenosaunee is to these 5 and now 6 nations, like American is to a citizen of Delaware, right? And we had a constitution that we had developed, the Great Law of Peace, that explained how this federal system worked. And so we decided to help out Ben Franklin, and we gave him and his founding father friends advice, and the resulting constitution, the one still in force here. It's it's the oldest one on earth still in force. And so our political ideas, at least the Haudenosaunee political ideas, still govern this continent in a major way. And the whites, they brought many, many new crops and technologies that will still be useful here long after the scars of 1492 have gone. The Gaiweo, it's a Haudenosaunee holy text. It specifically cites European-style houses as a good idea that we should adopt. It was compiled in the 1800s, I want to say. And we can use these crops in a newer, better, more advanced form of this food forestry technology of our ancestors. That's kind of what we're doing out here in Tobar, is we're creating new food forests. We're trying to find synergies old and new between crops. The existence of the United States of America has allowed us to apply ourselves in technological fields besides food forestry. I once dated a Zuni girl who interned with NASA. Our peoples are at the forefront of scientific discovery today in a way that just wouldn't have been possible without America's existence. Some of us, and we weren't just victims of westward expansion, right? Besides our own westward expansions, we also participated in America's and helped make it possible in the first place. Some of our nations, first off, were American allies. Academic history only really remembers and valorizes opponents of American westward expansion. It first did this because America itself needed its vanquished foes to be noble and mighty to valorize itself, and now it does this because academia has utterly renounced any nuance around manifest destiny and sees their last stands as the only noble deeds of the era. European power has often grown only because our nations ourselves saw it in our interest somehow. Cortez himself sparked a native revolution against the Triple Alliance and could not have possibly conquered Mexico without the help of opponents of Mexica imperialism. The people who sold Manhattan to the Dutch for $24 were selling enemy land, which is legitimately a brilliant political move. The Shoshone had some battles with Americans, but leaders like Pocatello secured an advantage over their rivals by allying with America, and to this day they have their own sections of Nevada towns where Shoshone law prevails, and they call these things Indian colonies. Love that phrase. Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce said that it was the pride of the Nez Perce to say, "We are the friends of the white man." White settlement in Oregon reached a point where the Nez Perce would resist militarily for a time, but initially this approach was widespread and remains current to this day. Even at the Battle of Little Bighorn, Custer was employing Crow and Shoshone scouts wanting revenge against the Lakota. So a lot of times we'd help the whites out of revenge. And another example of this is a year after the death of Custer, Lakota warriors were helping the literal 7th Cavalry they'd just beaten take down Chief Joseph Nez Perce, trying to flee to the Bear Paw Mountains in Canada. That's an interesting story. Like, the Nez Perce were really hard done by, and then, like, but they were, like, honorable warriors. They didn't kill any civilians, and you know, like, they were treated honorably by Sherman, but their main request, just let them go home or on to Canada, he denied. They were instead interned in Indian Territory, what's now Oklahoma. He praised their humanitarian conduct, but he was concerned about the pacification of the country. I disagree with his decision, but I understand it. The country's new boundaries were new, and they were fragile to his generation, and so national unity was much more of a fighting matter to him. This was the guy that, you know, did the March to the Sea, burned down the mansions in Georgia. I just want to, like, he was a lot more complicated than I think the modern left portrays him. Like, I'm not saying, but, like, I don't think the things he did in the West were outright evil. Like, he wasn't a Custer's, like, out to just butcher people to become president one day. In fact, he refused to ever be president. He's the reason we call it a Sherman statement. You know, if elected, or if nominated, I will not run. If elected, I will not serve. You know, that Sherman came up with that. So he was basically having kept the country together in Georgia. He was being asked to keep the country together out west, and he did a soldier's best to carry out some really iffy orders. And I mean, I think I blame more the people that gave him the orders and the general task. If there's gonna be blame, it goes more to the politicians than him. He was just trying his best to do justice to everyone. Didn't really do it to the natives, but did more, I think, than, like, in most of his generation would have. Because he was careful to acknowledge the humanitarian conduct of the Nez Perce and tried to return it as much as he could. He just couldn't give in to their reasonable demand, unfortunately. But yeah, so how else did we help the American westward expansion? Many trappers, explorers, and guides were of mixed ancestry, or if they were just white, they married into native families. Like, Jim Bridger had many different native wives over the course of his life. And this is how a lot of Americans, probably the majority of whites even, have ancestry like mine, where it's kind of mixed. During the height of the West's open range period, we were cowboys, so were former slaves, and a lot of Hispanics as well. Individuals from eastern native nations, like, participated in events out west, like the California Gold Rush and settlement of Oregon. Yeah, you read of, like, Cherokee and Shawnee heading out to the gold fields. And yeah, even Native Hawaiians actually are recorded as participating in both, and they're not Native American. I mean, well, okay, if you say the word Native American, yes, but they're not, like, they're like their own thing, kind of, like, because Hawaii, the Hawaiian population is not directly related to the rest of the native population of North America. But the fact is, even before America was fully a country together, you had native Hawaiians coming here, acting like settler colonials, and I just find that fascinating, because, like, and, you know, like, it's, this whole westward expansion is, even at the height of its, like, the, I guess you could say, white supremacist aspect of it, you had, like, a lot of people who were not whites or white supremacist coming on the back of it and kind of just being allowed to tag along. Like, it just seemed to be like, so long as you were okay with the system, you were fine, and if you were not okay with the system or somehow not reconciled to it or reconcilable to it, that's when it came after you. But yeah, like, we got to destroy Axis fascism under the American flag. That was base as hell. some of us were even key to it, like the Diné, again, Navajo, code talkers. It was not a... Now, it's funny because the Diné themselves are the most extensive branch of Native Americans throughout the world, because they've got, like, a little branch of relatives out in, like, Russia. And we're not talking, like, right across the strait and, like, of the Bering Straits in Kamchatka, like the Inuit are, right? We're talking, like, right next to the Urals, like, halfway in Europe. That's how far they went. And they did this in prehistory. And we only recently, like, within the last 100 years, figured out that they were Diné, the descendants of the Diné. But yeah, like, despite being the most widely spread Native Americans in the world, their language is so obscure that they could just talk to each other in that language. And they had, like, little code words for certain things, like tanks were called turtles and bombs were called eggs, I think, stuff like that. But in, the Diné language. And, obviously, the Japanese knew that these native nations existed, but it's not like you could go down to the store in Tokyo and find yourself a Navajo Japanese, translation guide. So these were effective codes, and they could just talk in their native language over open, uncensored radio, and the Japanese still couldn't understand it. Let's see. So, back to that one guy I was telling you about in the Caddo explorer in French Louisiana. There's always been a continent-wide trading system, because all he was doing was just following it. And it mostly went along the rivers and across the mountain passes, and a lot of places where the interstates still go to this day, like along the same tracks in many cases. But so this trading system's always been here, but America's is better integrated than ever. Like, interstates are kind of awesome. I mean, I know all the problems with cars and all that, yeah, but like, just there's a very real level of freedom that comes with all that, and it shouldn't be underestimated. Let's see, speaking of the American Indian movement, we have been allowed to protest in defense of our rights, and our rights have been slowly improving over time. And you see that with most Nazgul frontier states like ours, or the Mongols, in fact. Like, the rights of the underclass, kind of, the people who are not the master race or faith or ethnicity or whatever, like, their rights slowly improve over time in a Nazgul system, not in a fascist system. That's why fascist systems collapse quickly. But part of the reason for the longevity of a Nazgul system is that the underclass do have a realistic hope of enjoying the same rights as that overclass over time. And, like, as the Nazgul states of the Mongols degenerated towards democracy, that's where ultimately the institution of Soviet communism came from, I think. You can trace that institutional line from Genghis Khan to Vladimir Lenin, because Genghis Khan's Yasa just gradually included more and more Russians over time. When the Russians adopted it themselves, it gradually included more and more workers, and then finally to the point, like, when it stopped doing that under Nicholas II, then to fulfill those expectations, those 800-year-old expectations of the working people of Russia, a figure like Vladimir Lenin was necessary to set that Yasa order right. So, like, whereas in here, there used to be scalps, bounties put on our head for our scalps, by state governments, but now some natives are, like, actually quite wealthy, because they managed their nation's mineral rights or whatever. I think the Osage would be like one such. And then some tribes, or some nations like the Lakota, are incredibly not wealthy because they were kept poor deliberately, because they were like the last and hardest and most bitter opponents of the federal government. But all of our rights have been improving slowly over time. And just having voting rights inside of a nuclear superpower seems like a manifestly good thing. Like, so I don't want to break apart America, partly because I want my Shawnee people to have nukes. And I don't think if we partition North America that the Shawnee are going to get nukes. But if we keep it together, we do, So last but certainly not least, in fact, most, what we get out of this Continental Union is peace in North America. I've got both Shawnee and Haudenosaunee blood. Which side would I take in another series of beaver wars when the Haudenosaunee try to colonize the Shawnee? Peace between the Shawnee and the Haudenosaunee is good for me personally, and our Continental Union is the only thing guaranteeing it. And these ancient ethnic hatreds are absolutely not over, and any land-back scenario would go full Balkans in 5 seconds. Why? Let's talk about those Black Hills again. They're basically Jerusalem. The Lakota, the Crow, the Cheyenne, the Kiowa, land back to whom exactly? Any attempt to seriously answer this question with borders in reality would start an actual fighting war, and it's not worth it. Because of these disputed Black Hills, otherwise decent and liberal Lakota, I know, absolutely hate the Crow, and vice versa. And in college, I was friends with everyone, and I rented an apartment with a Lakota and a Crow at the same time, and we were all friends, and it was constantly remarked to me, who didn't see anything weird with that at the time, but just how unusual that was, because not so much like a Lakota or a Crow befriending a white person, but like a Lakota and a Crow befriending each other. So, that all said, what would our place be in a socialist United States of America? There will still be a U.S. military requiring soldiers, so our warrior traditions will let us fulfill our rights to manhood while defending the American working class. And not only is this something we can do and have done, but we're extra good at it. Our native languages are codes uncrackable to the enemy. We invented hand signals for warfare and taught it to the U.S. military, who then taught it to the world. And our traditions inspire us to great feats of courage and bravery. Despite being a handful of refugees in a post-apocalyptic wasteland, we were so good at fighting that it still took America a century to conquer the West. Reservations are the halfway house of sovereignty. The only true sovereign in America is the federal government, which sources its sovereignty from the states and their people. In such a system, native statehood would be the fullest possible expression of our sovereignty, and the associated senators would give us king-making power between the two political parties. The immediate post-war mission of a socialist America will be building socialism back better, or to put it a better way, radical reconstruction. It'll be radical reconstruction of the environment as well as the cities, and nobody is placed to give better advice on this front than the native nations. One aspect of the next radical reconstruction should be buying out the farms atop the depleted parts of the Ogallala Aquifer in Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas, restocking them with wild bison herds to restore the environment of the southern Great Plains, and give local native nations there a closer attachment to their bison hunting culture. Similar endeavors should be undertaken with other native nations' cultural attachment to the land, like increasing salmon populations, and therefore, in the long term, the salmon catch in the Pacific Northwest. And the last two aren't degrowth, but an attempt to make growth happen in places where capitalism exhausted resources. Irrigation agriculture was in the Ogallala Aquifer was farmers putting themselves out of business, growing wet crops in dryland and depleting the aquifer. They could have grown more dryland crops and lived there perpetually, but they didn't. They wanted to get rich quick. And then hydroelectric dams were a good idea at the time, and they should stay there at least until our immediate energy crisis is fixed. But in the long run, we should build out new nuclear plants to replace those hydroelectric dams, and let both the salmon and a revitalized domestic shipping industry swim freely from the mountains to the sea. And America is a nation of ideas, not of blood. Any genuinely American traditions arising from blood and or soil have to come from us. The Constitution, the bald eagle, the bison, these symbols of America are all rooted in us. America needs us like we need her. And now you know, and knowing is half the battle. Hot Take Express!